Welcome. I'm Jake Nuno, financial planner.
I'm Kirk Barbera, and we talk about financial topics that we think are interesting for you. ESG is a bad word in the realm of ESG. So,
Exactly.
yeah, the latest dirty word in corporate America is ESG. And that was like the word that was the, pinnacle of corporate words. This is like everybody was using ESG this, ESG that, diversity this, diversity that. Now they're like, no, we're no more. This is kind of a dirty word. It's hush hush. Put it on the table. Maybe we'll do a little bit of it. So there seems to be a backlash. And first, ESG. What is ESG? You might have heard this in the news, but this is a big movement that if you're working at a big corporation and listening to this, I bet you know or you're affected by ESG on some level, right?
Yeah,
What
you've
is
heard
it?
this. Yeah, you've heard this topic in a conference call, I'm sure,
Yeah,
or
a conference
yeah,
call.
on a
Yeah,
focus call from your corporation.
yeah.
It's environmental, social, and governance
Mhm.
investing or emphasis.
Yeah.
And it's like the screening through which corporations are to be making decisions about future investments in their company, the way in which they structure their hiring processes, how they manage their internal processes with dealing with people and employees, et cetera. And the whole idea of it was to make a focus toward like sustainability in those different areas. So, sustainability of the environment, sustainability of governance within your organization, and socially how you're affecting your community around you as a company, right? So the overall objective was always for good.
Hmm. Well, okay, so it's yeah, I think it was the good that they thought was good. Like it's
Yeah.
this is the standard of what they're saying is good rather than I think in the past. I mean, there's been other things like this, right? And we actually did a show about this a while ago where you predicted, I think we both agreed on this, that this was probably just a fad,
Mm-hmm.
that this was not real. People were really excited about this like a year, 2 years ago. Like, oh, this is going to change the world. This is how we're going to affect capitalism. This is how we're going to improve the world system. And, you were like, this is probably just a fad. And it
Yeah.
ended up being a fad, right? Like, it seems like it's a fad. Maybe it'll come back, but it seems like, this study is saying that just in the last couple weeks or months or something, 8% of CEOs have stopped using the term.
Right.
And it doesn't sound like a lot, but it doesn't say exactly what level of CEO that is. But I think you see that even in big corporations, more and more people are moving away from that. I mean, I've heard even stuff in terms of woke. There seems to be a backlash against quote unquote what people might call woke. There's a backlash on, even the way that people think about inclusivity. There's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
these types of backlashes. For better or worse, it seems that there is a backlash against it. And ESG is one of those.
One of those that has suffered. There's two aspects of this that are important to distinguish that we're kind of talking about from interchangeably, but one is ESG emphasis within a corporation. So, like if you're an employee or you're the CEO of a corporation and you're setting objectives for your company, and they have ESG objectives interwoven into them. But the other piece of this that we talked about before is investing according
Mm-hmm.
to ESG standards. So that's where you're finding like mutual funds that are specifically investing in companies that meet these criteria of screening according to those same pillars: environmental, social, and governance. So this article is talking about how like now companies, when they're on shareholder calls, they want to stay clear of even using the terminology of ESG because of the narrative that has been portrayed in the public that people perceive now as like the wokeness or whatever it may be as it's being interpreted. Now, investing, that's also true because I've had clients come to me and they sit down and they're like, what is with this company ESG and what are they doing to our world? And
Okay.
so we have to like take a
Yeah.
step back and first talk about how ESG is not a company. It's not, let's start there.
Yeah.
And it's investing strategy. And here's what the investing strategy is. And you can choose to pursue an investing profile according to those objectives, or you cannot. Right. So I think there's a big miscommunication that's happened as a result of like the politicization of this terminology.
That's a really good, important point that I didn't think about. So there's the ESG movement, essentially, which is an
Yes.
ideology. There are people who are not investors. There are people like in HR departments or just on college campuses saying we should advocate for companies making decisions with ESG in mind. And here's what we mean
Yes.
by that. And so there is that broader movement. You might see it in broader culture. You might see it in memes, on podcasts. But then there's literally, as you're pointing out, the actual investment firms that are trying to say, okay, so in the past, one of the dominant ways that we've made decisions on who to invest in as a company is, does that particular, like if I'm going to pick for a mutual fund, like I want to pick company Y. Okay, that why am I picking company Y? Why am I doing that? Y is because Y maximizes for shareholder profits. And here's my standard for selecting shareholder profits. That's my number one criteria. And I could go wrong with that as a mutual fund selector. I could select, company Y, and I should have selected company D as in, or maybe I weighted them too wrong in the wrong direction. It's very complex how to invest your money and that's why you put your money into mutual funds and you let those people do it with. And then again, hopefully the idea is that they're selecting, or in the past, primarily for shareholder returns, which is what
Right.
your clients, me as an investor, as just a normal American putting my money into, right?
Yes. Right.
So that's that. Yeah. Oh, that's a good clarification. So there's that, but then there is um, well, I guess the secondary thing is that what's changed is they've not taken away shareholder profits as like that's irrelevant. I think that's a misunderstanding. That's
Correct.
not what's happening with ESG. It's not like, oh, we don't care. We're going to invest in this, guy in his backyard who says he can run cars on water. He has no proof. There's no profits. There's no sales. But the heck with it. Let's just give him all of our money because he's, got a good vision for the world and he's ESG. He's really
Right.
focused on environment. So that's not what ESG is, to be fair.
No.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's also some of the narrative that's been perpetuated, which is where like the extreme um pessimistic view of ESG comes from, is that people thinking it's that like,
Yeah.
oh, you're going to ruin our uh
Retirement.
retirement because you're focused exclusively on diversity and inclusion. No, that's not really what the purpose of trying to frame an investment around ESG pillars is trying to do.
Yeah. So what it does do though is it weights more importantly companies that do have environmentalism,
Mm-hmm.
social, and governance based on certain principles of what that means as
Yeah.
high important factors.
Right.
And a mutual fund selector or other people will take that into consideration and
Mm-hmm.
maybe give it an ESG or an E or an S or a G or whatever, as they're good at. They're good at that, with also the expectation that they're also good at the returns.
Right. They're
Both.
still like a good and company worthy of an investment.
Yes.
Right. And
Now,
sometimes it's interesting if you look at like an ESG fund, if there's because they have funds, mutual funds that, despite what this article says, there's still a lot of funds out there that call themselves ESG funds and people want to invest in them. They're not shying away from it. They're still investing in companies that we all know of, right? Like Amazon is probably still one of the largest holdings in that mutual fund.
mhm.
However, if you look at like the ESG screening of Amazon, they perhaps have a high environmental score because they've released a whole fleet of electric trucks that they're using for deliveries now. that has reduced their carbon footprint, right?
Mhm.
So they've moved up in the role of an environmental scale for the purposes of inclusion into that mutual fund. So it's not as though like they're looking for the mom and pop shop that make no money and, you know, only raise farm chickens and, you know, do these things that are, you know, exclusively for the environment. They're still investing in normal companies, but it's this framework that has been created as a way for people to feel like they're contributing to a cause that maybe they feel more compelled to do than other people.
Well, that was the assumption, but it seems like there's a backlash. So it's not
Yeah.
really working. So,
Mhm.
according to this website, the Wall Street Journal, this website, investors yanked more than $8.2 billion from ESG funds in the first 9 months of 2023, according to Morningstar. So it seems like there's a lot of investors who are saying, maybe to you, maybe to people like you within the industry and others in similar fields, right? Or similar aspects. If there's ESG and that's a focus, don't put my money there, right? And they're basically saying so that what that sends a signal to companies is there's not a lot of upside to them financially to put the ESG in. So
Right.
it's the backlash has been you put money in ESG, or if you as a company identify or are identified as an ESG type company, you risk losing millions, hundreds of millions or more of money from investors. And that's a
Yeah.
big deal,
It is a
obviously,
big deal. It is
for
a big deal.
people. So companies are deciding that this is a kind of dirty word, is what this
Yeah.
article is saying.
Yeah. Which it's very, I find it super interesting because a lot of, and as I've seen with people who have asked me that question and said the exact thing, it's funny you said that. Like they call me up on the phone and say, are you guys making decisions about this according to this ESG stuff? Because if you are, I don't want any part of that investment strategy. But they don't even understand the concept first, right? They just know based on whatever political figurehead they've listened to or whatever media outlet has told them ESG is a woke concept. They want nothing to do with it. And so
Mhm.
when you explain to them the idea, then it's like, oh, well, but I like Amazon as an investment. Are you telling me that that's part of the woke corporate culture? Yeah, actually.
Yeah, so there's a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding, I think. I mean, I think when we talked about this in our first video, I am and I was and I am a little reluctant at the idea that this is a primary focus for companies in terms of that they should like to me the question is and the difficulty of ESG. Let's say we're on the side of that this should be something that companies should take more seriously, assuming they don't, which I think I'm more pro business than some, right? As we've discussed on the, but let's say they don't. We want to make this. The question is, what is the underlying motivation behind the people that are behind ESG as a marker of success, and what are they really trying to accomplish? So that I think is the worry, and I think people on certain political spheres are blowing things out of proportion and making things that aren't true, true. So for instance, one thing that's not exactly ESG, although it's kind of ESG, is the whole airlines situation. Like, I don't know if you know what's going on with the airlines in terms of being woke or not, but what you're seeing in the political spectrum is people, particularly people on the political right, making arguments and talking about like, look, you have what is it? Boeing is an ESG quote unquote woke type company, and their screws are coming unloose. There's that article where the
Mm,
plane door burst open in midair or whatever, and they
right.
had to land. Nobody was hurt, of course.
Yeah.
Everything was fine, which is to me a miracle in and of itself of quality craftsmanship,
Exactly.
and that something like that can happen and still nobody gets hurt. But it is a concern. And so, like, the fear now that a lot of people have, and I think there's just no going back anytime soon. I think in my view, ESG is gonna be dead because that fear is so prominent
Mhm.
that people like, I don't care if it's a good movement. If I'm going on planes, I'm investing in planes, I'm not willing to risk my life for this. Right. And
Mhm.
and that's the view people have. But I think that's kind of what happens on a political, how
Mhm.
politics and how these ideas actually affect not only your wallet, but your everyday life,
Yeah.
which is part of the thing we talk about on the show a lot, is that these big ideas, these big movements actually impact your life in a variety of ways. So there's this idea of let's have ESG, let's have woke in corporations. It goes into mutual funds. And then the everyday person hears about it somewhere and says, no, I don't want to do that, or I do want to do that. And how the decisions each of you listening make
Mhm.
matters.
Yeah.
It matters. Like, it really does.
It does matter. And I think one of the things in this article they talk about is the actual more specific objective setting, goal setting for companies that they're now trying to do in their earnings calls and what the information that they're sharing with the public, rather than trying to sort of put it under this broad umbrella of ESG, right? So that please invest in us because we are have a focus on this quote unquote good stuff, right?
Mm.
Whereas now that didn't work, that backfired in a lot of ways because now you've seen the way that that's been interpreted and misunderstood. And so instead of taking that approach, companies are now going to need to start saying like, okay, we're going to actually invest $50 billion in this type of distribution machine because it cuts down on X percentage of uh, carbon footprint, or whatever those specific objectives are that can be measured and met. That's going to be the new approach. So it's like
Mhm.
still kind of the same thing, but I would say like, okay, well, before it was definitely a marketing technique, right? The concept of ESG is a marketing technique that came from a marketing department.
Mhm.
It's like 20 years old. The idea of ESG, this concept has been around for like 20 years. So it's not like it's a brand new thing, but it was a marketing technique. It's a way for people to say, okay, as climate change becomes more and more of a talking point, this is a way for corporations to sort of latch themselves to dollars that are maybe being invested in companies that are contributing to a better future, maybe not, but they called themselves ESG. And so that was an easy way for the public to divert dollars that way, right? I wonder if on the investment side of things, if we'll start to see sort of a rollback of those funds that are specifically marketed themselves as ESG. There's entire companies like fund families, like
Mm.
like Fidelity is a fund family, right? Well, there's a company that is that's all they've branded themselves as is ESG specific. And so some people will build their
Mhm.
entire portfolio with just funds from that family because they have marketed themselves as an ESG fund family. So it'll be interesting to see if how that narrative changes regarding, okay, do you change like the focus of those funds now instead of ESG? Is it like these are, this fund excludes oil companies, or this fund, more specific ways of identifying the impacts, the social, the government, the environmental impacts of those investments.
Yeah, I mean, that'll be, I mean, I think what you're pointing out also is that there have been for a long time, not just ESG, but there's things like, what do they call it? Social corporate responsibility or something like that. Like there's a whole
So,
movement to,
SRI, yeah,
yeah, I don't,
socially responsible investing.
yeah, like there's stuff
There's
like
been a
that.
bunch of those. Yeah, it's a
Yeah. And
lot of
ESG is just one
yeah.
of them. And,
Mm-hmm.
personally, look, my personal view is we should just have stakeholder or, the shareholder returns as the dominant view and let the shareholders duke it out essentially with who they invest in and make that decision. That's my personal opinion as a non-professional. But I get, that it makes sense to have I get the argument of having like different perspectives that someone can take when they're trying to sift through the infinite seemingly types of investments they can make, right? It's like I want to invest in this and this.
Right.
Well, but I don't want to invest, even though, these companies have the best returns. I don't believe in what they're doing, so I don't want to, participate in that. And I get that. I think that makes sense. Like you shouldn't want to invest in what you don't believe in, which I think is the core of what's going on with the backlash. Is I think whether we like it or not, the people who are backlashing are saying, I don't agree with this. Like
Uh-huh.
they're saying, I don't know, not only I don't agree with now what they could be wrong and probably are wrong and misunderstanding it. And there's misunderstandings, purposeful misunderstandings on certain stuff, right? Like but there's there's still stuff where it's like there's people who are contentious about what's the role of nuclear and uh, um, fossil fuels in our lives. Like there's actual contention about that. And that's a difficult one for us. I know some people say
Mhm.
there's no contention and that's fine, but some people do think that. And so if you're going to ask people to vote on their values with their money, you may not agree with their values, and that's the whole point.
Mhm.
And I I I'm curious why it needs to be such a clear movement. That's what's interesting to me, because what you're saying, Jake, and I think makes is really interesting is like, why can't we just have, forget these movements integrating into HR departments? Why can't investment companies who are looking at these funds rate them themselves and just let people know their own thoughts on, like, look, these are the best returns, but we think that they're really bad at this, this, and this, and just kind of give it its own grading. And each investment company can do its own thing. I don't know.
And
Rather
there
than like has
is
to be a part of this big movement of ESG or social corporate responsibility.
there has been, as a result of the big movement, there's some like some of the analyst software that we use to evaluate mutual funds. One of the big ones, in fact, called Morningstar,
Mm-hmm.
they now have incorporated into their data set, which their data set is like thousands of different metrics that they can look at for a mutual fund. They now have um, not necessarily screening, but data for that fall into the categories of environmental impact, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they can measure based on a specific company or a mutual fund and the companies that are within that mutual fund, just what the exposure is so that they can now give you that information in a data set that's easy to understand. And then you can make that decision for yourself. The thing is, with these companies that are now taking that information and then they package it together in theory into an investment that's supposedly meeting all that criteria automatically. So that's where I say it's
Mm.
always important to do your own research, number one. But I also tell my clients a lot that, look, when we're talking about investing in mutual funds, you are one of probably a million plus investors. And while your money is important, it's in the pot of a very large pool. And so your influence is very limited with your dollars. And so a lot of times, if you really have a conviction in an idea or an ideology or a focus, your own dollars that you're contributing and using every day in your local community have a much greater impact. And so sometimes
Mm.
it's more beneficial for us to maybe shift your charitable contributions to organizations that feed that initiative for you,
Yeah.
right? Because bringing it back locally, not only is that making more of an impact, you're also knowing for certain that those dollars are going where you want them to go. Whereas if I'm just putting it into a fund that says, according to this website, that this company's doing this kind of work with it, yeah,
Yeah.
but I
They could
mean,
be fudging it or like
yeah, or
making it look like that.
right, that's all marketing and branding.
Yeah.
So you have to be really careful with that. And so I think really it's sort of, I just roll my eyes at this
Yeah.
concept because it's not, it's become politicized. It's become something that, I think there were good intentions at the beginning, but I think that every good intention has, bad narratives wrapped around it. And you have to be really careful with stuff like that. And you also have to be careful as an investor, which is something that Kirk and I think wholeheartedly is so important, is like taking control of your own decision making when it comes to your money, is making sure that like you're not just following a trend of what's happening as a shift, as a generational shift, like a fad, because that's really what you're doing. And what ends up possibly happening is, like we talked about, those ESG specific investments are focused too much on the wrong metrics that end up hurting your rate of return, which at the end of the day is the overall objective for why you're investing in that growth fund, right? Like, yes, it's good to have those ideals that
Value
you want to
driven.
pursue. Yeah. But you have to be careful about, like, is that impeding on the overall objective for investing for retirement? Like, I still need this money to grow.
Well, that's because you have that view that that's the purpose of all of this. And that I think is the criticism. But and I think this is a good place to we could wrap up and kind of give a bow on everything. And what we're talking about is ESG is a certain movement dominantly in marketing and HR departments of um, these big corporations, which are, out of how they're rated by mutual funds and other investment companies, that pass down to the everyday person who says they do or do not want to invest in this company because of XYZ, because of these ESG. And that's really at the bottom line. And it seems like there is a backlash against it because the values, whether perceived correctly or incorrectly, are being assessed by the individual investors as something they do not agree with. And so they're asking to take their money out. And there is significant views, which then trickles all the way up to the corporations who are saying, we need to slow this down. And so they're saying it's a dirty word within corporate culture. It's you're in a boardroom or you're in a meeting and you're talking about, well, what can we do to be more, environmentally friendly? And they're like, it's like that kind of thing. No ESG stuff.
Buzzword. Yeah.
Yeah.
Triggered.
Like get out. Yeah. Trigger. Get that out of here. Cause we're losing money.
Yeah.
And let's figure out how to make the money. But I really liked, so that's what, just to kind of wrap up, that's, I think, the core thing to take away from this. But then the actual practical advice that you just gave, I think is really helpful. It's healthy in my view to just think about your money, the money you work really hard for, to put it into a place and into with the best minds in the world to grow for your own purchasing power tomorrow and to your retirement as tomorrow as well. But like literally tomorrow or a year from now when you might need it versus 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now to have enough money to live off of and live a good life. And then you can think about how to have philanthropic desires to advocate for the kind of change in the world that you want to advocate for and be thoughtful in that as a separate factor. And that, I think, is the practical thing. Is part of the issue seems to be trying to fix the world through corporations through this means. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to fix the world through corporations. If that's what you want to do, okay, figure out how to do that. But it seems like this type of thing is not the right methodology because people are rejecting it and it's too confusing. Like if you want to change corporate culture, well, one thing is start a corporation that competes with some of these other corporations, or maybe try to work at these, I don't know, but that's a challenging thing to try to do. I think trying to affect it in this outward way has proved problematic, and splitting it into philanthropy for yourself, making the impact you can. And you could think about like, hey, I'm going to take 20% of my profits from these evil corporations that I don't agree with and put that into philanthropy or something like that.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's something you could do is you're taking something that you're getting from them, instead of putting it back into them, you can put it into, in supporting the programs that you like.
And ultimately that's going to be way more effective.
Yeah, because I think this other way is taking away your profits, and not only taking away your profits, you're not just the companies, but your individual shareholder, you're making less money. You're going to have less of a good life,
Mhm.
not just the big mega corporations. So that I think is something to take into consideration as you pursue these other philanthrop, philanthropic goals that you want to.
Philanthropic.
Yeah.
That's
That
a
that
mouth. Yeah.
that is a mouthful, but I think that's the ESG lesson, and we'll see if it
Mhm.
comes back. But so far, our prediction has come true, which has proven true quite a few of our predictions, not all of them, but the fad thing is pretty accurate.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
indeed.
there you go.
It's
There you go.
interesting.
It's
Interesting
interesting.
stuff.
There you go.
Well done.
All
I don't
right.
know how we end this now. I think you just stop it, right? Like we just
Okay, you don't want to do, yeah, because I'm still going to put the whole one up there, but we'll stop it now.